Did you know that legally speaking, there's an invisible fence that surrounds your property at all times? It's true. Today, we're diving into trespass to land, the legal idea that creates this boundary and protects your personal space. Let's get right into it. So, we've all seen them, right? Those classic no trespassing signs. They look super official, almost like you have to have one. But is that actually the case? Do you really need a sign to legally keep people off your property? The answer is probably not what you think. So the short answer? Nope. You don't need a sign at all. And that's because the law itself has already built a boundary for you, that invisible fence we just mentioned. Your right to your own land is protected by a really simple but incredibly powerful rule that's been around for centuries. This whole idea comes from an old Latin term, quare closum freget. It basically translates to, why did you break the close? And in this legal world, the close is just that invisible boundary line. The law just assumes your property is already enclosed, which is exactly why a sign isn't necessary. It's all about protecting every property owner's fundamental right to just be left alone. Okay, and here's where the law gets even more serious. Trespass is what's called actionable per se. Now, that's just a fancy legal way of saying you don't have to prove any actual damage was done. You don't need a broken fence or trampled flowers. The simple act of someone entering without permission is the harm. That's because your right to decide who gets to be on your property is that fundamental. So, let's say you were to bring a trespass claim to court. You'd need to prove 4 main things. Number 1, the entry was unauthorized. Pretty straightforward. 2, you're the one in possession of the property. 3, the entry was intentional, and we're going to dig into what intentional really means in a minute. And finally, 4, it was a direct interference. It's a really clear checklist for the courts. Okay, so we've got this invisible fence protecting our land. But what does land actually mean in the eyes of the law? You might be surprised, it's a lot more than just the dirt under your feet. The definition is, well, it's huge. There is this ancient legal maxim that puts it pretty dramatically. It says your ownership extends up to the heavens and down to the depths. I mean, just think about that. In theory, your property rights stretch from the center of the earth all the way up into the sky. It's a massive, massive concept. Now, in the real world, this means land isn't just a flat plane. It's a 3-dimensional space. It includes the airspace above your property, up to a reasonable height, of course. It includes the surface and any buildings on it, and it includes the subsoil, stretching way, way down below the ground. Now let's see how these rules actually work in the real world. We're going to look at 2 landmark cases, not as some dry legal text, but as some pretty wild stories that help define the trespass laws we still use today. Our first story is one I like to call the case of the tulip trap. It goes all the way back to 1828 and involves a guy named Holbrook who was, let's just say, extremely protective of his tulips. So, here's what happened. Holbrook's prize-winning tulips kept getting stolen, and he got fed up. So he took matters into his own hands and set up a spring gun trap in his garden. But, and this is the crucial part, he didn't post any warning signs. Then, a young boy named Bird wandered into the garden chasing after a stray bird, tripped the lyre, and was very badly hurt. The court's ruling was a huge deal. They basically said you cannot do something indirectly, like setting a hidden trap, that you are forbidden from doing directly. Holbrook couldn't legally just shoot a kid for trespassing, right? So he couldn't set a trap to do the exact same thing. This case drew a really clear line in the sand about how far you can go to protect your property. All right, our second case looks at a totally different but just as important question. What about intent? What happens if someone ends up on your land completely against their will? This brings us to the very strange case of the unwilling trespasser. So in this case, the defendant, a guy named Stone, was literally physically thrown onto the plaintiff's land by a group of other people. He did not choose to be there at all. So the court ruled that because his entry wasn't voluntary, it couldn't possibly be trespass. The big takeaway here is that the person entering the land has to be the one who actually intended the action. Okay, so now that we get the basic rules and we've seen them in action, let's start to wrap this all up. We're going to look at some common exceptions to the rule, the valid offenses for trespassing, before we pull it all together for a final summary. You see, the law isn't always so black and white. Even if it looks like a clear-cut case of trespass, the person might have a really good defense. For example, what if they had your permission to be there? Or what if they were a firefighter entering your property during an emergency? That's called necessity. Or maybe they had legal authority, like a police officer with a warrant. All right, let's boil this all down into the key takeaways. First, trespass is any unauthorized interference with someone's land. Second, and this is a big one, it's actionable per se. No proof of damage is needed. Third, the entry has to be a voluntary act. Fourth, remember land is three-dimensional: sky, surface, and soil. Fifth, you absolutely cannot set dangerous traps for trespassers. Remember the tulip trap. And finally, there are valid defenses, like having consent or it being an emergency. And that's pretty much the core of it. All of this leaves us with a really modern question, though. We're talking about a law that's centuries old, built on the idea of a physical boundary. But in our world today, with drones flying over our backyards, doorbell cameras recording the whole street, and GPS tracking our every move, what does it even mean to break the clothes anymore? Something to think about.